So, welcome to BCIMO Early Day. And this section is about the history of rail. So we're gonna have three very good speakers who are gonna walk through the history of rail for us. But to begin our journey through 200 years of rail, we're joined by someone who brings engineering history to life on screen and in real life. Please welcome Lawrie from Lawrie Mechanical Markets.
And it's gone forever. There you go. Right. Hello, everyone. So I see a few faces out there of people who recognise who I am, and a lot of you going, who is this long-haired bloke? So I'm Lawrie, and my day job is creating YouTube videos. So I'm passionate about trying to get people into heritage, whether that be cars, fire engines, trains, and I'm acutely aware that we live in a changing world, and the future of so many things that I love rests in making our hobbies more accessible. And if we don't inspire the current generation and the next to get involved, then we're going to lose so much of our heritage, and that's a really scary thought. And so that's why days like today are so important, to show off an industry to a whole new generation, and hopefully to make some good memories that might spark off an interest or maybe a career in this railway sector. Being here is really exciting for someone like me who enjoys machines, to see development of what's coming next, and being on the cutting edge of the future of rail transport is genuinely exciting, and to see it being done in the UK is even more so. Now, as my remit is mostly about heritage vehicles, I was given the topic of the history of rail to talk about. For those of you who aren't rail aficionados, this is an incredibly vast and varied subject, and at first I wasn't really sure how to approach it. Rail changed this country forever. It was a revolution for both the normal person and for the industrial might of a nation. For us to appreciate the sheer scale and the size of it is quite difficult. We're so used to having everything that we need available just when we need it. We're able to travel to where we want to. The world has become so much smaller over the last 200 years, and to really understand the changes, I want to take you away from the Midlands, back to my homelands of Suffolk. 125 years ago, the turn of the last century. By now, the railway was a well-established phenomenon, taking and linking the country and turning the wheels of industry. Suffolk, however, had missed out on a lot of this, and it remained a poor rural farming community. And it's hard for us to really appreciate how life was, but rural Suffolk remained one of those places where life went on untouched. You were born in a village. You grew up in the village. You didn't go to school because there wasn't one. You met someone in the village and you married them. And then you ended your days in the village. It was a noteworthy trip to go to a neighbouring village, an adventure to go to the nearest town of Stowmarket, and perhaps you'd hear stories of someone who'd adventured as far as Ipswich, the county town, or going to London. Well, that was the stuff of legends. Then, over the next 4 years, the railway came, and this wasn't some high-speed interconnected network, just a single line with trains just winding their way down a country railway. But the difference that made, well, it allowed money to flow into the area. It allowed goods to be exported further afield, easily getting to Stowmarket or Ipswich in a day, travelling to London or, Dudley. The world opened up. It brought in new technology. Steam ploughs and threshing drums could be brought in. I cannot stress what a revolution this was, and how much in a few short years the whole world changed, and the future and the opportunities that it presented. Bigger still was the impact it had upon the next generation. School. The next generation would be educated. They'd be able to read and write. Can you imagine being the first in your family to be able to read a book, to be able to write a letter? It gave more control and more understanding to families. I am a driver at the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway today, and one of my great memories is of a lady called Edie, who sadly now passed away, but she used to ride the railway to go to school. That's how she got to school, and in latter years at a preservation railway, she used to come back and ride it again, which was lovely. Anyway, I hope this has helped you to visualise the impact the railway had when it came to an area. Mid-Suffolk was no different to the rest of the country, it just happened a lot later than the rest of the UK. But I can't stress enough how much the railway completely revolutionised life, not just for the rich and the famous, but for people like you and me. Now, 200 years ago, with the birth of the first passenger-carrying railway, it was a hugely exciting time. There is nothing today that really captures the same fever of excitement, pushing of known technology and progress. The nearest parallel that I can really think of is the current race for space with companies like SpaceX pushing on to a new frontier. They're pushing the limits of known technology, and they're constantly developing and refining new ideas. they're pushing the very limits of materials that we have to our disposal. They're pushing into new areas that are unknown, and every trip is not a success, and much is to be learnt from failure. It's something really exciting, capturing human imagination 200 years on from the buzz of the early railways. And it's hard to see railways in the same groundbreaking excitement as a literal space rocket, but the buzz was even bigger. To think 200 years ago, it was discussed that the speed of the early trains might be too fast for a passenger to draw breath. And it's hard to get into that mindset, but when literally nothing had gone that fast before, this was indeed a brave new world full of opportunity and development. So to bring this back to what I'm actually meant to be talking about, the history of rail. Now, as you can imagine, it's a huge subject and I can't really cover it in the space of a single 20-minute talk. Aside from my initial point of the impact of the Come the Railway had, I want to touch on how little we actually know about these early railways. Bearing in mind, this was a time before photography and, well, what we know is taken from personal records and contemporary sketches from the time. So when you think of the history of rail, no doubt your initial thoughts will go to a steam locomotive, maybe famous household names, Mallard, Royal Scot, Pendennis Castle, or, Flying Scotsman. There are engines from the golden age, the 1920s into the 30s, a mere 100 years ago. And when we celebrate 200 years of the passenger-carrying railway this year, it quickly becomes apparent that so much of the old engines that we know and love and consider to be part of the early days of the railway are in fact actually rather modern. What's even more mind-blowing is the fact that the steam engine didn't really change that dramatically from the groundbreaking Stephenson's rocket, which famously won the Rainhill trials in 1829. Sure, if we compare Rocket with Evening Star, the last steam engine built by British Railway in 1960, you may be inclined to argue that these two are entirely different beasties. However, the basic machine didn't really go through any more dramatic revolutions. Sure, Evening Star is a lot more refined than Rocket, but when you break it down, they're the same basic machine underneath, one's just a lot bigger. As Rocket was unveiled 4 years after the opening of the first public railway, the Stockton-Darlington in 1825, which is what this Rail 200 thing is all about, the engines hauling trains on this groundbreaking railway were, well, they're a very different beast. And so different to the image that we conjure up in our heads when we think about a steam locomotive, a veritable flail of moving rods and cranks with strong roots back to stationary industrial engines. That said, even these machines, as cumbersome and uncivilized by our standards, had been pretty cutting edge. If we go back a little over 100 years before that to the first steam engines to be commercially developed by Thomas Newcomb in 1712, the thought of putting one of these hulking, great, building-sized behemoths onto wheels and to be self-propelled would be of the same level of madness of, oh, I'm just going to go to Jupiter for an afternoon. It took almost 100 years, or 92 in fact, for the technology to be refined enough for Richard Trevithick to be able to create the first steam locomotive. And this was effectively a stationary engine turned on its side with the technology of a steam hammer placed on wheels. And whilst this wasn't a huge success, it was too heavy and it broke the cast iron rails beneath it, it changed the world because it sold the concept of the steam locomotives. And of course, it famously won a 500 guinea bet. It also wasn't rapid. On its famous run, it averaged about 2.5 miles an hour on a 9 3/4 mile tram road. Things had to develop quite rapidly in order to have something that was a viable form of public transportation. Now, the other thing to note is I said tram road, not railway. Today's railways have a flange wheel that runs on a rail. The flange stops the wheel from falling off the rail. The tram road was like an L-shaped cast piece of iron plates laid together, that L shape keeping the wagon from going in the right direction, keeping it on the rails. Now, this concept of a guided wagonway was not new. There are records from grooves for a wagon cut into limestone in Greece from about 600 BC, to which, to clarify to all you, that's a really long time ago. Now, obviously, there aren't any photos from this time, but records suggest this remained in use for some 600 years. And obviously, this is a far cry from what we'd call a railway. The next steps towards this, what we'd call a railway, came about the 1550s in Europe. Trying to move a cart across rough ground is hard work. Bearing in mind there would be no roads as we know today, you'd have tracks, akin to just walking across a field. If you could provide a smooth track, your horse could pull more in its wagon. The very distant relative to the modern railway was little more than 2 parallel wooden boards on which a cart could roll along, and it had a metal pin that came down in between the 2 planks that kept the thing kind of following the direction of the planks. Now, it's generally accepted the great ancestor of the railway that we know was the Woolerton Wagonway, which ran for about 2 miles utilising horse and gravity power. And now I see a couple of you are wondering what horse and gravity power is, and that's quite simple. You have a horse that pulls it uphill towards the mine, because despite mines being underground, they're normally on the side of a big hill. And then to come back down, you use gravity. Much easier. Now, it's thought that the wood rails were the same L shape to keep the cart on the track. And in recent years, there has been talk of an even earlier wagonway near Liverpool around 1600. But doing the research, I found that there's been talk about an earlier railway, and that's about it. So anyway, these wooden rails were great, and they allowed heavier loads to be moved, and over time it became a common practice to cover the wooden rails with a thin plate of iron. That extended their life. But the plating caused more wear on the wooden wheels on the wagons, and somewhere in the middle of the 18th century, cast iron wheels were introduced, with one being recorded on a wooden railway near Bath in 1734. The obvious development from this was to lose the wood altogether and have cast iron rails, which are the first recorded to have appeared in 1767. These were infinitely more durable and would have allowed much heavier loads to be carried, but remained that still L-shaped like the wooden predecessors. In 1789, the world took a step closer to the railway that we know, with William Jessup unveiling his flanged wheel. Now, the wheel itself would follow the rail. So now we have metal rails and we have a flanged wheel. Much heavier loads can be moved, and the time of the horse was coming to an end, which brings me on to where the term horsepower comes from. James Watt coined the term to help sell his steam engine to compare the work they could do versus a horse. The big thing to note from this is when they said a horse, what they actually meant was a pit pony, so perhaps we should be talking about pony power, not horsepower. And when you think of a horse, something like a Suffolk Punch, a massive Great Shire horse, well, that's about 20 horsepower. So the whole system is totally wrong, and it amused me greatly. Anyway, getting back on track, I mentioned the first locomotive was built by Trevithick in 1804, which, as mentioned, whilst it achieved what it set out to do and pulled a train, it broke the cast iron rails beneath it, and the railway went back to being horse-powered. The first commercially successful steam engine was Matthew Murray's rack locomotive, Salamancia, built for the Middleton Railway in Leeds in 1812. This was a twin-cylinder locomotive, unlike Trevithick's single-cylinder thing, and this solved the problem of adhesion by having a cogwheel, which had teeth on it which grasped the rail as it went along. So this was also the first rack railway in the world. This was followed in 1813 by the locomotive that you probably heard of, Puffing Billy, built by Christopher Blackett and William Headley for the William Colliery Railway, the first successful locomotive running by adhesion only. Puffing Billy is now on display in the Science Museum in London, making it the oldest locomotive in existence. See, the other big problem with railways at this point was there was no standardisation for the gauge of the rails. It was very much done on a case-by-case basis of whatever there was room for. So today, all the main lines in the UK, and mainly the heritage railways, and that was outside over there, this is built to what we call standard gauge. This is 4 foot 8.5. The reason behind this is it's the gauge that George Stephenson used. It was the gauge of the Killingworth Railway, where Stephenson had been appointed the railway right in 1812. So, having developed and improved winding engines to pull wagons up the long rope, Stephenson saw the potential for the so-called travelling engine and built it to run on board the colliery system. So it had to be built to that gauge, being 4 foot 8 inches. So he then built the Head and Colliery Railway, which, by the way, was the first railway to be designed from the start to be operated without animal power. And so it was only natural to continue building to this gauge. When George was made the engineer behind the Stockton-Darlington project in 1822, it would involve running some engines of his own design, so it made complete sense to continue with this proven track width. And with a bit of widening to get that extra half inch, this went on to be the global standard track size. Most of the world run their trains on standard gauge. Now, many of you will have been to Europe or maybe to the USA, and you'll be looking at me strangely and saying, I'm sure their trains are bigger. And you'd be right. The problem is what we had with developing the locomotive hauled railway early is that as soon as somebody put a bridge over the railway or put a platform next to it, every single item of rolling stock, wagon, coach, locomotive or otherwise, had to be thin enough to not collide with the platform and low enough to pass under the bridge. This is what is known as the loading gauge, how wide and how tall railway vehicles can be. In the UK, we have a very restricted loading gauge. In Europe and the USA, it's much, much bigger. So wider and taller locomotives can run, which is why they have double-decker carriages and double stacking containers. It also meant that locomotives designed to run on the British network can go and run elsewhere, like Flying Scotsman did when it went to the USA and to Australia, but something like the Big Boy can't come and work here. Anyway, Returning to the Stockton and Darlington, the reason we're celebrating Rail 200. This wasn't actually a huge success. In fact, in terms of proving the locomotive was the future, it was a bit of a disaster. Soon after opening, locomotive number 1, the flagship, and the only locomotive that had hauled the opening train, broke a wheel. It's recorded that the cast iron wheels on number 1 and number 2 were a constant source of trouble. More locomotives were purchased from other builders, which had mixed results, and eventually a 6-wheel design by Stephenson proved to be reliable. But in 1828, 2 steam locomotives exploded within 4 months of each other, which is pretty much a bad move. The result of the poor performance of the cutting-edge steam locomotive meant that when passenger services started on the Stockton and Darlington, they were actually pulled by horse. The lack of trust in the steam locomotive was very much evident while Stephenson worked on completing the biggest project, the world's first intercity railway, in 1830. This was a double-track main line linking Liverpool and Manchester, to which the driving force behind the railway were not convinced on locomotives at all, with horsepower or stationary steam engines with winding drums being considered. It was through this concern that the famous Rainhill trials were hosted, to show that a locomotive could be a reliable form of motive power for trains, something of which Rocket proved with very little doubt. The railway age was now very much with us, and the railway spread and evolved quickly. The first underground railway, the Metropolitan, opened in 1863, from just about mastering steam-powered locomotives to having a railway underground in the space of just 38 years. The Underground was a huge success, evolving into the Tube, which keeps London moving today. These first railways were steam-hauled, though, as the steam locomotive was now a tried and tested device, but you can imagine how poor the air quality would have been with a steam engine running. The engines in these early days had condensating apparatus to try and recycle the steam back into water in the tanks to stop it filling the tunnel with steam and blocking vision, but it did nothing from the smoke and soot from a fire. Apparently, crews would fire their locomotives in the station where ventilation was better, but it must have been awful. The mad thing is that the first electric train had already been demonstrated in 1842 by the Scottish chemist and inventor Robert Davison up in Aberdeen. By 1891, Roundhay in Leeds saw the opening of the first British tramway, getting its power from electrical cable suspended above the line. This worked well and trams spread throughout the urban areas, and by 1903 the Mersey Railway opened the first electrified main line. But this was still a very long time before the end of steam. Diesel locomotives started to appear in the early 1930s, before any locomotive had actually hit 100 miles an hour, well, officially anyway. This happened in 1934 with the Flying Scotsman earning its place in history, and it also persuaded the LNER to stick with steam rather than adopting diesel technology. What a different railway we'd have today if the LNER had abandoned steam so early. The race for speed continued, with the LNER and the LMS battling it out for faster and faster locomotives, and in 1938 Mallard became the fastest steam engine in the world, hitting 126 miles an hour. Following this, it was decreed that trying to get higher speeds was getting silly, and some terrible accident was bound to happen, and all further attempts at high speeds were banned. The railways were invaluable during the Second World War, and they kept the country running. Particularly the Southern Railway, with its packed commuter network, was able to continue operating, as there was normally some other way around that trains could continue running and get to their destination. Certainly without the railway, the outcome of the war would have been very different. However, this did take its toll on the country and its railways, and in 1948 the railway network was nationalised to British Railways, who took on a programme of standardisation to produce new classes of modern steam locomotives to replace the thousands of classes they inherited from the Big Four: the London North Eastern Railway, the London Midland Scottish Railway, the Southern and the Great Western, if you didn't know. Now, this proved to be a fairly poor move, because in the 1950s, BR realised they were falling behind Europe in terms of railways, and they decided to launch the modernisation plan to move away from steam in favour of diesel and electric traction. Europe would also benefit from having a comparatively new and modern railway system, having been forced to rebuild much of its network following the events of the Second World War, whereas the UK was still effectively running a Victorian railway. The modernisation plan was pushed hastily into action, the last steam locomotive, Evening Star, being completed in 1960, and then just 8 short years later, on August the 11th, 1968, the last steam service to be operated by British Railway, the 15 Guinea Special, ran. Now, whilst it's true that dieselisation was very much the way forward, scrapping locomotives that had been designed to operate into the 1990s after 8 years was a huge waste of investment. And things didn't really look up for BR. The network was hemorrhaging money, In 1957, the speed limit for lorries had been lifted from 20 miles an hour up to 40, and this made road transport a serious contender for freight, and that hurt the railway. Car ownership was also on the rise. BR's reaction was an inspection by Dr. Beeching in 1963, who proposed shutting a huge part of the network, concentration on the more profitable major trunk lines and losing the smaller branch lines. Thus, many communities whom the railway had bought everything lost their railway link with the outside world. The railway underwent a rebrand in 1965 to become British Rail, and in 1966 they electrified the West Coast Main Line, and that was followed by the East Coast Main Line in 1976. However, this wasn't the end for diesel traction with the introduction of the Intercity 125, the world's fastest diesel train. The Class 43 HSTs, or high-speed train, are still in service in some parts of the country, although they are being retired, so you probably should go travel on those whilst you can. In 1987, we got our first railway from the future, the Docklands Light Railway in London. But as part of the built as part of the regeneration of the London dockyard area, it was everything the area needed: new, clean, regular services and completely lacking of a driver. The entire network is driverless and remains in operation to this day, and if you've not had a chance to ride on it, I highly recommend a visit and go and sit at the front of the train and pretend you're the driver, because it never gets old. In 1994, the railways was privatised into over 100 companies, although the track and the infrastructure remained in the public control under Railtrack, which in 2002 became Network Rail. 1994 also saw the opening of Eurotunnel, allowing quick and easy journeys from London across to Europe. This is one of the most exciting developments in recent times on the network, beaten only by the opening of the UK's first high-speed railway, HS1, in 2007, which continues to build on Eurotunnel's network and speed as a modern railway. So that was a very brief history of railway in the UK, and I've missed out a load of important bits. But I hope you've enjoyed listening to me, and I'd like to thank the Very Light Rail National Innovation Centre for having me along to be part of the day. So sorry for not looking at you. That was an awful lot to try and remember on that.